On a gray Monday morning in November of 1982, Richard Thomas Bradley stood at the edge of the factory floor at Precision Components Manufacturing in suburban Detroit, watching the first shift filter through the employee entrance, their lunch pails rattling and their work boots scuffing against concrete that had been worn smooth by 3 decades of foot traffic. He had managed this plant for 17 years, overseeing 240 workers who machined specialized parts for the aerospace industry, and he believed he knew everything worth knowing about the men and women who operated his lathes and milling machines. He recognized their walking patterns, their habits, their strengths and weaknesses with the casual familiarity of someone who had spent thousands of hours studying human behavior in the context of industrial production. What Richard did not know, what he could not have suspected as he sipped his morning coffee and reviewed production schedules, was that 3 of his most reliable workers were Soviet intelligence operatives conducting one of the most sophisticated industrial espionage operations ever attempted on American soil. And the small detail that would eventually expose them had nothing to do with spycraft or surveillance. It had everything to do with the way they handled their tools. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Richard Thomas Bradley was 49 years old that November, a stocky man with thinning gray hair and hands scarred from 4 decades of working with metal. He had started as an apprentice machinist in 1958, fresh out of high school, working for the same company that would eventually promote him to plant manager. His father had been a tool and die maker, his grandfather a blacksmith, and Richard carried forward a family tradition of understanding how metal behaved under pressure, how precision could be achieved through patience and skill, how the smallest deviation from specification could compromise an entire assembly. He had an instinct for manufacturing that went beyond book learning, an ability to walk through his plant and know by the sound of the machines whether they were operating properly, whether the workers were focused or distracted, whether production was on schedule or falling behind. Precision Components. Manufacturing occupied a sprawling facility on the outskirts of Detroit, a city that in 1982 was struggling with the collapse of the American automotive industry. The plant had survived by diversifying into aerospace work, machining components for commercial aircraft and, more lucratively, for military contractors who needed parts that met exacting specifications for fighter jets and surveillance systems. The work required security clearances for certain employees, government inspections of the facility, and strict protocols for handling classified design specifications. Richard had managed this transition carefully, understanding that in an era of Cold War tensions, his plant was manufacturing components that could theoretically give the United States a technological advantage over the Soviet Union. He took the responsibility seriously, perhaps more seriously than some of his corporate superiors who saw only profit margins and production quotas. The 3 workers who would eventually be exposed as Soviet agents had all been hired during a period of rapid expansion in 1978 and 1979, when Precision Components had won several major defense contracts and needed to triple its workforce almost overnight. Thomas Greenberg had arrived first, a 38-year-old machinist with impressive credentials from a technical school in New Jersey and 15 years of experience at various manufacturing facilities. His resume showed steady employment, good references from previous supervisors, and expertise in complex milling operations. Michael Reeves came 6 months later, 34 years old, with similar credentials and a quiet competence that made him popular among co-workers. The third, David Patterson, was hired in early 1979, a 41-year-old specialist in precision grinding who could work to tolerances of 1 10,000th of an inch, a level of skill that was genuinely rare and desperately needed. All three men were model employees. They arrived on time, worked diligently, rarely took sick days, and produced work that consistently met or exceeded specifications. Greenberg was known for helping younger workers learn proper technique. Reeves volunteered for overtime whenever it was needed. Patterson had actually caught several quality control issues that might have resulted in defective parts being shipped to customers, earning commendations from Richard and bonuses from corporate management. In the hierarchy of the factory floor, where reliability and skill determined a worker's reputation, all three men had established themselves as valuable assets. Richard trusted them. The other workers respected them. The security officers who conducted periodic background checks had found nothing suspicious in their histories. What Richard could not know, what the FBI would only piece together much later through painstaking investigation and information from Soviet defectors, was that all three men were Soviet illegals, deep cover operatives who had been inserted into the United States with false identities and assigned the long-term mission of infiltrating American defense manufacturing. Their real names were Alexei Volkov, Dmitry Sokolov, and Viktor Petrov. They had been trained at a special facility outside Moscow, where the KGB taught selected operatives how to function as American workers, how to adopt American mannerisms and speech patterns, how to blend into industrial environments without attracting attention. They had spent years learning their technical skills, not because they loved machining or took pride in craftsmanship, but because those skills would give them access to facilities where America's technological secrets were manufactured into physical components. The operation they were conducting at Precision Components was elegant in its simplicity. They were not stealing blueprints or photographing classified documents in dramatic late-night operations. Instead, they were methodically gathering intelligence about American manufacturing capabilities, tolerances, materials, and techniques by simply doing their jobs and paying attention to everything around them. Greenberg worked in the section that machined turbine blade components, learning precisely how American engineers had solved specific metallurgical challenges. Reeves was assigned to work on guidance system housings, gaining insights into the tolerances and specifications required for electronics that would guide missiles to their targets. Patterson's precision grinding work gave him access to finishing specifications that revealed exactly how smooth American aerospace components needed to be to function in extreme conditions. Each man kept detailed mental notes of everything he observed, memorizing specifications, tolerances, material compositions, heat treatment processes, and quality control standards. They met periodically at various locations around Detroit, always careful to avoid patterns that might suggest coordination, and compared notes. Once every few months, they would travel separately to Chicago, where a Soviet handler operating under diplomatic cover at the consulate would receive their reports, photograph the information they had written down, and transmit it to Moscow via secure diplomatic channels. The operation had been running successfully for more than 3 years by November 1982, and the intelligence they were providing was helping Soviet engineers understand exactly how far behind they were in manufacturing precision, what techniques they needed to develop, and what tolerances they needed to achieve to match American aerospace capabilities. The detail that would eventually expose them was so small that most people would never have noticed it. But Richard Bradley was not most people. He had spent his entire adult life watching workers handle tools, and he had developed an unconscious understanding of how skilled machinists moved, how they positioned their bodies, how they gripped measuring instruments, how they approached their work. On a cold Tuesday morning in late November, Richard was walking through the plant, conducting his usual inspection, when he passed Thomas Greenberg's workstation. Greenberg was using a micrometer to measure a component he had just finished machining, and something about the way he held the instrument made Richard pause mid-stride. A micrometer is a precision measuring tool capable of measuring dimensions to 1/1000th of an inch. American machinists learned to use micrometers in a very specific way, with the instrument held in the palm of the hand, the thumb operating the ratchet mechanism with a gentle rolling motion that ensures consistent pressure and prevents over-tightening that could distort the measurement. It's a technique that becomes so automatic after years of use that skilled workers don't even think about it. They just do it, the same way every time, with the unconscious precision that comes from muscle memory developed over thousands of repetitions. Greenberg was holding his micrometer differently. The basic technique was correct, the positioning was close, but there was something slightly off about his grip, a subtle wrongness in the way his fingers were placed, in the angle at which he held the instrument. It was the kind of detail that would be invisible to someone who didn't know what to look for, but to Richard, who had watched thousands of workers use thousands of measuring instruments over the course of his career, it stood out like a wrong note in a familiar melody. It was as if Greenberg had learned to use a micrometer by following instructions and practicing technique, rather than by absorbing the method naturally through years of apprenticeship and repetition in American machine shops. Richard continued his rounds without saying anything, filing the observation away in the back of his mind. He told himself he was being overly critical, that people developed slightly different techniques based on where they learned their trade, that there was no single correct way to hold a micrometer as long as the measurements were accurate. But the observation nagged at him for the rest of the day, and when he returned home that evening, he found himself thinking about Greenberg's grip, instead of focusing on the television program his wife was watching. Over the next week, Richard began paying closer attention to Greenberg, not in a way that would make the worker suspicious, but with the careful scrutiny of someone trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite articulate. He noticed other small details. Greenberg's workbench was too organized, arranged with a precision that suggested conscious effort, rather than the comfortable chaos that developed naturally when someone worked in the same space for years. His tool chest showed similar characteristics, with every item in its designated place, as if Greenberg had memorized an organizational system rather than developing one organically through trial and error. Most tellingly, when Greenberg helped younger workers, he explained techniques with the slightly formal precision of someone who had learned from instruction manuals rather than from master craftsmen who passed knowledge through demonstration and correction. These observations might have meant nothing, might have simply reflected Greenberg's personality and work habits, except that Richard began noticing similar patterns with Michael Reeves and David Patterson. Both men held their tools with that same subtle wrongness, that suggestion of learned behavior rather than ingrained habit. Both kept their workspaces organized with an almost military precision. Both explained techniques to co-workers with careful, formal language that sounded slightly off, as if they were translating from some internal reference rather than simply sharing knowledge they had absorbed naturally over years of practice. Richard said nothing to anyone about his observations. He had no evidence of anything actually wrong, just a collection of tiny inconsistencies that probably meant nothing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about these three workers, something he couldn't quite define, but that triggered instincts he had learned to trust over decades of managing industrial operations. He began watching them more carefully, noting their interactions, their patterns, their behavior during breaks and shift changes. What he observed deepened his unease. The three men never socialized together, never gave any indication they were anything more than casual acquaintances. But Richard noticed they had an odd habit of leaving the building at slightly staggered times, always in the same sequence: Greenberg first, then Reeves 15 minutes later, then Patterson another 20 minutes after that. It was a pattern subtle enough that no one else would notice, but consistent enough that it suggested coordination. He also noticed that all three men carried identical lunch pails, nondescript black metal boxes that looked like thousands of other workers' lunch containers, but were always positioned at their workstations in exactly the same way, with the handle facing the same direction, as if some unspoken protocol governed even this mundane detail. One evening, in mid-December, Richard stayed late at the plant after most workers had left for the day. He walked through the empty facility, listening to the silence broken only by the hum of ventilation systems and the occasional clang from the maintenance crew working in the far wing. He found himself standing at Greenberg's workstation, looking at the tools arranged with that too perfect precision. On an impulse he couldn't quite justify, Richard opened Greenberg's tool chest and began examining its contents. Everything was correct. Everything belonged, but the organization felt wrong in a way he struggled to articulate. Then, as he was about to close the chest, he noticed something odd. The bottom of one drawer sat slightly higher than it should, creating a gap of perhaps a quarter inch between the drawer bottom and the lowest tools. Richard pulled the drawer completely out and found a false bottom that lifted away to reveal a small notebook filled with technical specifications, written in tiny, precise handwriting. The measurements and tolerances recorded in the notebook matched components that Precision Manufacturing was producing for classified military contracts. Richard's blood ran cold. He carefully replaced everything exactly as he had found. It closed the tool chest and left the plant with his heart pounding. He drove home in a daze, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. He could be wrong. The notebook could have innocent explanations, but combined with all the other small inconsistencies he had observed, it painted a picture that was deeply disturbing. When he arrived home, his wife immediately knew something was wrong. Richard paced through their living room for 20 minutes before finally explaining what he had discovered, what he suspected, what he feared. She listened quietly, then told him something he already knew but needed to hear from someone else. He had to call the FBI. The next morning, Richard drove to the FBI field office in downtown Detroit instead of going to work. He told his secretary he had a doctor's appointment, then spent 3 hours with Special Agent Catherine Morrison and Special Agent James Reese, walking them through every detail he had observed over the past month. The agents listened with increasing interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed they were taking his concerns seriously. When Richard described the hidden notebook, Morrison leaned forward and said that what he had stumbled onto might be significantly more serious than he realized. She explained that the FBI had been aware of Soviet efforts to infiltrate American defense manufacturing, that they had suspected operations were underway, but had struggled to identify specific operatives, and that Richard's observations matched patterns they had been looking for. What followed was an intensive counterintelligence operation that would eventually be designated as Operation Silent Tools. The FBI began surveillance of Greenberg, Reeves, and Patterson, documenting their movements, photographing their contacts, intercepting their communications. They discovered that all three men lived in modest apartments in different parts of Detroit, maintained minimal social connections, and periodically traveled to Chicago, where they met with a Soviet consulate employee who the FBI had already identified as a probable intelligence officer. Surveillance teams followed the men through dead-drop servicing in city parks, through brush passes in crowded shopping malls, through all the traditional tradecraft of Soviet espionage operations. But what made this case unique, what fascinated the FBI agents working the investigation, was that the espionage was being conducted primarily through the simple act of working skilled manufacturing jobs. The three operatives were not breaking into offices, or bribing officials, or stealing documents in dramatic nighttime operations. They were clocking in every morning, operating their machines with genuine skill, producing quality work, and gathering intelligence simply by being present in an environment where America's technological capabilities were being translated into physical reality. It was espionage, hidden in plain sight, disguised as honest labor, impossible to detect without someone like Richard Bradley, who possessed both the observational skills to notice tiny inconsistencies and the courage to report them. The FBI let the operation run for 4 months while they built their case, documenting every meeting, every communication, every piece of intelligence the three operatives passed to their handler. Richard continued managing his plant as if nothing were wrong, trying to act normally while knowing that 3 of his workers were Soviet spies. The strain was enormous. He found himself studying every gesture, every conversation, wondering what else he had missed, what other secrets might be hidden within his facility. His wife noticed the stress, saw how he had trouble sleeping, how he flinched every time the phone rang. But Richard understood the necessity of patience, of building an airtight case before making arrests that would expose the operation and potentially compromise other investigations. The arrests came on a cold March morning in 1983. FBI agents coordinated simultaneous raids on all 3 apartments, taking the operatives into custody before they could destroy evidence or alert their handlers. Richard was at the plant when it happened, called to the front office by security officers who told him 3 of his workers had been arrested by federal agents. He stood in the parking lot watching FBI vehicles drive away, feeling a strange mixture of validation and exhaustion. He had been right. His instincts had been correct. But being right meant that he had been working alongside Soviet spies for years, trusting them, promoting their work, never suspecting that their true purpose had nothing to do with manufacturing quality components for American aerospace companies. The case made national news, though many details remained classified. The 3 arrested men were identified in news reports as Alexei Volkov, Dmitry Sokolov, and Viktor Petrov, Soviet illegals who had been operating under deep cover for more than 4 years. Federal prosecutors charged them with espionage, conspiracy, and theft of trade secrets. The trial revealed that the intelligence they had gathered had been transmitted to Moscow and used to improve Soviet manufacturing capabilities, helping them narrow the technological gap in aerospace engineering and precision manufacturing. Defense attorneys argued that no classified documents had been stolen, that the men had simply observed their work environment, but prosecutors countered that the accumulation of detailed technical knowledge about American manufacturing capabilities constituted a significant intelligence breach. All 3 operatives eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for their cooperation with FBI debriefings about Soviet intelligence methods and the extent of KGB infiltration of American industry. They were sentenced to terms ranging from 15 to 20 years in federal prison, though all would eventually be released early as part of prisoner exchanges during the latter years of the Cold War. Their handler in Chicago was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States. The FBI used information from the debriefings to identify and roll up several other Soviet intelligence networks operating in American manufacturing facilities, leading to additional arrests and exposures that dealt a significant blow to Soviet industrial espionage capabilities. Richard Bradley became something of a reluctant hero within the counterintelligence community, though his identity was kept classified for years to protect him from potential retaliation. He received commendations from the FBI director and from officials in the Defense Department who recognized that his observations had protected significant technological advantages. But Richard never felt comfortable with the recognition. He was not a spy catcher or a counterintelligence professional. He was a factory manager who had simply noticed that something didn't look right and had the common sense to report it. The experience changed him in subtle ways. He became more cautious about hiring, more attentive to details that might signal deception, more aware that the Cold War was not just fought in distant countries, but in American factories and offices where ordinary work concealed extraordinary secrets. He also became more appreciative of the craft knowledge that American workers possessed, the unconscious skills developed through apprenticeship and repetition, the small details of technique that were so difficult to fake precisely because they operated below the level of conscious thought. The way someone held a micrometer, the organization of a toolbox, the language used to explain a technique. All of these could reveal whether someone had truly been shaped by American manufacturing culture or had simply learned to imitate it. In the years after the arrests, Richard occasionally consulted with the FBI on matters related to industrial security and the detection of possible infiltration. His expertise in recognizing the subtle signs of deception made him valuable to counterintelligence investigators who understood that human observation often caught things that surveillance technology missed. But he never took another position that required security clearances or involved classified work. The stress of knowing that enemies operated within his facility, the burden of maintaining secrecy while building a case, had taken a toll that he did not wish to repeat. Precision components. Manufacturing survived the scandal, though the company implemented significantly enhanced security protocols and background investigation procedures for employees working on defense contracts. The plant continued operating through the remainder of the 1980s, weathering the ups and downs of the defense industry, until it was eventually acquired by a larger aerospace conglomerate in the early 1990s. Richard retired in 1995, after 37 years with the company, and spent his remaining years restoring antique machine tools in his garage workshop, finding peace in the simple act of bringing old equipment back to proper working condition. The story of how a factory foreman's observational skills exposed a Soviet spy ring became a case study taught at FBI training facilities and in corporate security seminars about the importance of human intelligence in counterintelligence work. It demonstrated that sophisticated espionage operations could be undone by someone who simply paid attention, who trusted their instincts, who understood that small details mattered. The three Soviet operatives had been expertly trained, had maintained their cover for years, had successfully gathered valuable intelligence, but they could not fully replicate the unconscious habits that came from genuinely living within American industrial culture. And that failure, visible only to someone with Richard Bradley's unique expertise, had been their undoing. Years later, after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, documents released from KGB archives revealed that the operation Richard had exposed had been considered a high-priority success until its sudden compromise. Soviet intelligence had invested enormous resources in training and inserting the three operatives, viewing the intelligence they gathered about American manufacturing capabilities as crucial to closing the technological gap that handicapped Soviet industry. The loss of the operation had been seen as a significant setback, and KGB analysts had spent considerable effort trying to determine how the operatives had been detected. The answer, when it eventually filtered back to Moscow through various intelligence channels, must have seemed almost insulting in its simplicity. They had been caught because they didn't hold their tools quite right. Because a factory manager with 40 years of experience had noticed they didn't move like men who had grown up in American machine shops. Richard Bradley died in 2008 at the age of 75, having never discussed the case publicly and having been careful to protect the classified aspects even from his children and grandchildren. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his long career at Precision Components and his reputation as a skilled manager who took pride in quality workmanship. It did not mention that he had exposed Soviet spies, that his observations had protected American technological secrets, that his instincts had contributed to winning a small but significant battle in the Cold War. The FBI kept his contribution classified, and Richard preferred it that way. He had never sought recognition for doing what he considered simply his duty as an American and as someone who took pride in his profession. But within the intelligence community, Richard Bradley's story remained an important reminder of a fundamental truth about espionage. No matter how sophisticated the training, no matter how carefully constructed the cover identity, no matter how long an operative maintained their false persona, there remained details that could not be fully faked. Cultural habits formed over lifetimes. Unconscious techniques developed through years of practice, the subtle ways that environment and experience shaped how people moved and worked, these things could not be completely replicated through instruction and study. And sometimes, in places where no one expected espionage to occur, on factory floors and in machine shops where honest workers produced the components that translated technology into reality, there were people who knew how to see what others missed. The three Soviet operatives had understood machining. They had possessed genuine skill in operating lathes and mills and grinders, but they had not understood, could not have fully replicated what it meant to be American machinists, to have absorbed the culture and methods of American manufacturing through years of apprenticeship and experience. That gap between technical competence and genuine immersion in a culture, invisible to most observers, had been visible to Richard Bradley. And that visibility had been enough to unravel years of careful intelligence work and protect secrets that mattered in the ongoing struggle between superpowers. The factory where it all happened was eventually demolished in 2003, replaced by a shopping center and parking lot that gave no indication of the building's history. But somewhere in FBI archives, carefully preserved in classified files that may not be declassified for decades, sits the complete record of Operation Silent Tools. The surveillance photographs, the transcripts of conversations, the technical reports, and the initial observation report filed by Special Agent Catherine Morrison on the day Richard Bradley walked into the Detroit field office and explained that 3 of his workers held their micrometers wrong. It is a small detail to build a case upon, but sometimes small details are all that stand between security and compromise, between success and exposure, between the preservation of secrets and their theft. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.